Good afternoon. Today we are going to find the message out of the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 14 and chapter 15. I have titled my sermon, The Laws of Charity. And one thing that concerns most of the new members of the church who have been introduced to the responsibility of a believer is the obligation of tithing. And remember, to fully exercise the responsibility of tithe is not an easy challenge. It takes great faith in the Lord and deep trust for the faith community. However, it is not a common practice. We Christians talk about it or teach one another about it. Even though the tithing plays a significant part in believers' spiritual life, we rarely equip believers about the right or the responsibility of the law of tithe. But I have good news for you. In today's passage, Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 20 through 39, and you and I, we will encounter the very law of the tithes, and we'll have the opportunity to understand both the letters of the laws and the spirit of the laws. Let's first read the passage before we unpack the message. Verse 22, be sure to set aside a tenth of all that your field produce each year. Eat the tithe of your grain, new wine, and olive oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks in the presence of the Lord your God, at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. But if that place is too distant, and you have been blessed by the Lord your God and cannot carry your tithe, because the place where the Lord will choose to put his name is so far away, then exchange your tithe for silver and take the silver with you and go to the place the Lord your God will choose. Use the silver to buy whatever you like, cattle, sheep, wine, or the fermented drink, or anything you wish, then you and your household shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice. And do not neglect the Levites living in your town, for that they have not received the allotment or inheritance of their own. At the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of the year's produce and store it in your towns, so that the Levites who have no allotment or no inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widow who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied, and so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hand. Amen. Today's sermon deals with something very sensitive, and most of us have a great interest in this subject. It is about the tithe. Contrary to many people's thought, Scripture directly talks about it quite often, and it teaches us very practical wisdom on how to manage our finances. It is especially mentioned in the book of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, and of course today's passage is out of the book of Deuteronomy. The tithe system was organized in a 7-year cycle. In today's passage, we'll encounter these 3 laws of tithe, which I call them the laws of charity because they promote and foster a sharing community. The first tithe, it happened at the end of the year. The second tithe also happened at the end of the year. And the third one is called the poor man's tithe. It happened at the end of every 3 and 6th year. Let's look at the first one. At the very end of the year, every year, set aside a tenth of all harvest. This is commanded in verse 22. The Lord's definition of the law of tithing is simple. The Hebrew word masar means a tenth. Typically, it means to take or give a tenth of something. Before we dive into the study of the first tithe, there is another tithe. It is called general offering. It is also called heave offering or wave offering. It was a portion of the finished grain, wine, and oil separated for the Jews' feast before the first tithe. And this wave offering is also referred to as a great offering because it is the very first offering the people of Israel could bring before any other tithe of the offering. And the passage in the book of Ezekiel suggests that the great offering, this wave offering, should consist of 1/50 of the owner's grain and wine or oil. But anyway, in today's message, we are going to deal only the first and second and the poor man's tithe. So we are going to, let's look at only the laws of charity here in the three segments. Verse 2 of today's passage, 22 of today's passage stated that be sure to set aside 1/10 of all that your field produce each year. And therefore the law of tithing is simply state 1/10 of all their harvest, it has to be set aside. In today's term, it means the profit, compensation, or increase. It is the wage of one employee, the profit from the operation of businesses, the increase of one who grow or produce, or the income to a person from any other sources. That's 1/10 of that income has to be set aside. That is the first tithe. The first distinct mention of the word tithe in the Bible is happening in the very first book of the Old Testament, Genesis. Abraham was met by Melchizedek, king of Salem, and the priest of the Most High God. And the Melchizedek blessed Abraham as he was returning, who was returning from the victorious war against the four kings. The king of Shinar and king of Elisha, king of Elam, and the king of Goyim. They carried off Abraham's nephew Lot and his possession from Sodom, where he was living. And that's why Abraham went and fought with them, and they came back with the victory. Abraham gave him tithe of every spoils and plunders, according to Genesis 14:20. This hints us that even the very law of tithing is written in the book of law. The original spirit of the tithing is based on voluntary giving. The word tithe is mentioned again a few chapters later in the same book. Jacob at Bethel made a vow in these words, of all that you give me, I will give you 1/10. In this case, the tithe was promised by Jacob as a voluntary covenant. No one asked or commanded him to do so, but he volunteered first and made his vow to the Lord. The tithe is God's law for his children, yet the payment is entirely voluntary. Our obedience is voluntary. Therefore, our refusal to pay does not abrogate or repeal the law. This principle brings a question. If tithing is a voluntary matter, is it a gift or payment of an obligation? The answer is found in the book of Leviticus. The word tithe was mentioned third time in connection with the Levitical law in the book of Leviticus chapter 27, verse 30. The Lord spoke through Moses, and all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. It is the holy unto the Lord. At this point, the Lord has established the law of tithing, and because it is His law, it becomes our obligation to observe it. He said 1/10, the tithe is His. It is the Lord's. But one thing we need to know is that actually everything that we own belongs to Him. So actually instead He claimed everything that belongs to us is His. He's saying, I'm only claiming 1/10 of it as mine. In reality, the Lord gave everything we have, right? And so He only claimed the 1/10 of it. The tithing becomes a responsibility or duty for us in this way. Why did the Lord make this change to the principle of tithing? It wasn't for Himself. He did it for us. And this is very important for us to understand. Under the Levitical law, the tithes were given to the Levites for their maintenance. And the Levites themselves were directed to pay tithing on the tithe which were received by them to the priest and the high priest. If you recall, There was one tribe of the 12 tribes of Israel who had not received their land when the promised land was being allocated and divided among them by Joshua. When they were entering the land, it was the Levites. They were given only 42 towns and 6 refugee towns, which were scattered among other territories of 11 tribes, but no land for them to own. They were given a special mission, the responsibility to make their temple worship possible for all other 11 tribes of Israel. This made them a particular tribe, special tribe. However, in reality, they became underprivileged people because they had no means to make their living without help of others. That's why the Lord promised them that He would take care of them. Moses said, "They shall have no inheritance among their fellow Israelites. The Lord is their inheritance, as He promised them." This is Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 2. For the Levites, the Lord Himself is their inheritance. Then how did the Lord meet this need of the Levites? By instituting this voluntary sharing program, the law of the charity, the law of tithe. It is the law of charity. Deuteronomy chapter 18 verse 1 reveals this divine truth. The Levitical priest, indeed the whole tribe of Levites, are to have no allotment or inheritance with Israel. They shall live on the food offerings presented to the Lord, for that is their inheritance. Therefore, the tithing of the 11 tribes of Israel helped the Lord to keep His promise to the Levites, who substituted from their rights to the inheritance of the land to the privilege of serving the Lord at the dwelling of the Lord. And this is why the ministers and pastors and those who serve churches have right to have a make living out of the tithes of their congregation. Now you know why the 11 tribes of Israel were commanded to bring their tithe to the Lord. While their tithe had enabled their daily, weekly, monthly, and various festival worship, it provided the food for the people serving in the activities of worship at the dwelling place of the God. Therefore, we can say that original principle of tithing was based on the law of charity. So we can conclude that the tithing is a voluntary sharing program that cares and loves the underprivileged people such as a Levite. So this is the first tithe. It is to help and take care of those people who are serving God in the worship capacity. Now here is the second one. This one is called to do at every end of the year and set aside a 10th of 9/10 of the harvest. Most modern day Christian only knows about the first law of the tithe that we talked about, we covered in before, just now. However, the Lord had commanded them under the law of tithe to meet the need of the faith community and underprivileged people. They were asked to set aside a 10th of what's left, which is 90% of the harvest. After the first tithe, now you only have 90% of your harvest. And so 1/10 of what's left, 90% of harvest, is set aside for the second tithe. And they were asked to bring a 10th of that harvest, and they had to bring it to the people, such as the fatherless, widow, and the foreigners. These are called the second tithe. Listen to what Moses instructed the people here in verse 23. Eat the tithe of your grain, new wine, and olive oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks in the presence of the Lord your God, at the place He will choose as a dwelling for His name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. They were allowed to eat, drink, and party before the Lord among the people. This law brings a public festival since they had to meet as a community at a specific place, a dwelling for His name. The tithe was used to promote peace and joy and thanksgiving in the hearts of those people who participate, to bring unity among the community of faith made up of 12 different tribes. The Lord even made a provision to this second law of tithe to make sure all the people can follow the law in case they had too much to carry their tithe because the Lord blessed them too much. Then they were allowed to exchange their tithe for cash and take the cash with them to the Lord. At the time, the silver coin were used as their cash. So they were allowed to exchange to silver and bring it to the place, and they can buy the stuff for them to be able to eat and drink and fast together with other people. So this is the second tithe. The tithe that it is happening at the dwelling place, that the people who come to worship God and sacrifice before God will eat and drink and fellowship. Now this third one is very interesting one, because actually it is not the third law, because it is still the second tithe law. But what happened is, in every 3 years, and so, the way third year and the 6th year, 7-year cycle, they were asked to set aside that amount, the same amount, for underprivileged people. Instead, for themselves, those people who participated in the fest of the offering, they were asked to bring it set aside into their town so that underprivileged people can enjoy. Again, in verse 27, the Lord spoke, "And do not neglect the Levites living in your town, for they have no allotment or inheritance or their own." The Lord reminded the people of Israel not to neglect the Levites. Again, the Levites are still as considered a part of the underprivileged people in the community of Israel. To help the people of Israel to keep their lifestyle of charity, He gave them another provision to the second law. He commanded them to surrender the whole tithe that was prepared for the second law for the underprivileged people. The law commanded at the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithe of that year's produce and store it in your town, so that the Levites who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, the fatherless, orphans, and the widows who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied, and so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the works of your hand. These verses are found in Deuteronomy 14 and verse 22 through 29. Since these laws must be kept in every 3 years, this tithe period occurs in the 3rd year and 6th year of the 7-year cycle. Notice this time, the recipients of the benefit of the tithe now include foreigners and fatherless and the widows. Of course, the Levites are included again. This law of tithe is called the tithe for poor, which is happening in the period of the second tithe. So for an average Israelites, they were commanded to give a total of 19% of their income as a tithe to God, 10% to keep the first law of tithe for the harvest that was given to the Levites, and then 9% every year again to keep the second law, and then every 3rd and 6th year to help and feed the underprivileged people. But the Lord's desire to help disadvantaged people, underprivileged people, did not stop there. All these 3 laws of charity works on 7-year cycle. And that's why in the 7th year, God has made a particular law. It is a law of cancellation of debt. At the end of every 7 years, they had to cancel all debt. To free them from their debt, the Lord commanded the people of Israel this law, the 3rd law of cancellation of debt. The law declared that at the end of every 7 years, you must cancel debt. The Lord even outlined detailed guidelines for them. The Lord commanded the debt of the fellow Israel must be 100% canceled every 7 years. In the seventh year, the Sabbatical year, tithes are broken off. Since this year, all fruit, grain, and vegetable that are grown of themselves in that year are considered free and ownerless properly. So let's pause here and ask ourselves a question, very important question. Then why did the Lord give us the laws of charity? Why did God give us the laws of tithe? What were the purpose behind the laws? The answers are found in chapter 15. There are two sides to it. To make sure there is no poverty among our community. This principle seeks to achieve equality of wealth for all. The reason for the Lord to give us the law of charity was revealed in following verse 4 here. It said, however, there need to be no poor people among you. For in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess as your inheritance. He made sure that he wants to see no poor people in the land that he gave to them, the promised land. One might think this principle promotes some kind of idea of communism, but I don't think so. This principle promotes equal opportunity for equality of wealth. It does not demand a fair distribution of wealth. This way, there are no people who live in absolute poverty. The purpose we have miserably failed though. In our world history, various ideology came and gone, and we still experiment on some of them, but neither communism or capitalism satisfy the purpose mentioned in today's passage. Too many people in the world, more than 1/3 of the world population, suffer daily by living under absolute poverty. Why did we fail? The law of charity was given to the people of God to make sure there are no poor people among the kingdom of God. But it has one condition. Moses said, he will richly bless you if only you fully obey the Lord your God and are careful to follow all these commands I'm giving you today. Unless people put the laws of charity in practice, the equality of wealth among people would not be achieved. Sadly, even in the history of Israel, there was not also a single period that they fully met the obligation of these laws of charity. It's not about what ideologies we believe in, but it is where our heart lies. As long as we trust the Lord our God and obey his command, then we may experience the fulfillment of the second purpose of God in the law of charity. Here is the second purpose: to make sure there is a flux of God's blessing among our community. This principle seeks to achieve ongoing prosperity for all. His blessings to the people of God were very specific and practical. First, the Lord promised that the people of God will lend to many nations, but will not borrow from none. See, when the Lord blesses his people who obey the law of charity, the blessings of finance will come. Second thing, the Lord promised that the people of God would rule over many nations, but none will rule over you. Blessing of leadership among nations will come. Third, the Lord promised that the people of God would be blessed so that in all their work and everything they put their hands to will be blessed. Blessing of enterprises, everything that they do will be blessed. One principle for us to remember is that our participation in the law of charity strengthens our faith and our spirituality. And then it increases our capacity to love and solidify testimony among the community we belong to. What should we be our attitude toward the laws of charity? It is simple. It's still the same as it was for the people of Israel. Three things, but one message. Do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward the needy. The Lord recommends that if anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns of the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward them. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. The message is clear. It commands us to be open-handed. Second one, do not harbor wicked thoughts toward the needy. Verse 9 challenges, be careful not to harbor this wicked thought. The seventh year, the year for canceling debt, is near, so that you do not show ill will toward the needy among your fellow Israelites and give them nothing. Again, verse 10 command, give generously to them and do so without a grudging heart. The Lord commands us to give generously. Again, it means to be open-handed. Third, do not give with a grudging heart here. Verse 11 repeated and said, therefore I command you to be open-handed towards your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land. The Lord commands us to be open-handed toward the poor and needy. And message is clear that the principle of tithing, the law of charity, should be more than mathematical or mechanical compliance with the law, but it is more than a matter of hearts also. It must be done by both our hearts and our hands. If we pay our tithe because our love for the Lord, in complete freedom and faith, we narrow our distance from Him and our relationship to Him and become intimate. Then we are released from the bondage of legalism. And anybody will give us the satisfaction of knowledge one is complying with the will of the Lord, bringing the blessings that comes from sharing with others through the purpose for which tithing is used. We cannot afford to deny ourselves these blessings. We cannot afford not to pay our tithing. We have a definite relationship to the future as well as to the present. What we give and how we give and the way we meet our obligation to the Lord has eternal significances. I pray that somehow we all understand this, the concept and the spirit of the laws of charity, that we continue to exercise and let the blessing of God overflow through our life. May God bless you.